Now, I'm joined today by Dr. Khandekar for a very important discussion on the reality behind this latest IPCC report and what we'll get into, which is really the lack of credibility at this point of the IPCC and the reality of climate change. Now, Dr. Khandekar worked actually as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for the IPCC, including for their 2007 report. He is also an expert in meteorology and an expert in extreme weather, and he's published well over 150 papers over many decades, 50 over 60 years of studies. So he's a very well-accomplished academic in this area. So, Dr. Khandekar, I wanted to start by just addressing some of the most extreme hype and headlines and scare stories that people are getting out there, just to get that out of the way. And I was personally kind of shocked because I was looking at the coverage of this latest IPCC report from Nature. And if people know, Nature, the journal, is supposedly one of the most prominent, most cited, most well-established journals in all of science, right? And in their coverage of this latest report, they literally say, they quote one scientist, and they say, this new IPCC report means, quote, without aggressive action, the world could become an almost impossible place for most people to live. That is, we don't go through extreme actions to reduce CO2, the majority of mankind on the planet is not going to be able to exist on this planet. That is a shocking, extreme statement, and I would like your thoughts just to start off on that.
When I did my IPCC review in 2005 and 6, the report came out in 2007, I was very disappointed. Among several things, my disappointment was because I had suggested several definitive changes to be made in the final document. Sadly, not one single change I had suggested was incorporated in the IPCC final document. And henceforth, I almost lost any interest in the IPCC documents, reading them. I have browsed the recent one, 2013, but I find it again repetitious and repetitious. There is nothing new. All they have been saying is we have to reduce CO2 if we want the climate to behave smoothly. What do they mean by that? We will always have extreme weather events in the Earth's climate system. It is an integral part of the Earth's climate system. So why bother reducing CO2 at an enormous cost of perhaps several trillion dollars? And at the end of the day, what do we get out of it? Nothing.
Well, I know the IPCC and other organizations run these models that claim to show that human CO2 emissions are going to be a catalyst for driving all of these unprecedented or otherwise impossible or unexplained changes in the climate system. But those are just what the models say. Aside from models which are based on those assumptions, is there actually any concrete, definitive scientific proof that CO2 emissions and the percentage of CO2 emissions coming from mankind is at this point going to be the major driver of changes in the climate?
No, in fact, this hypothesis of CO2 causing warming was first put or sort of suggested by the IPCC in their 1995 assessment. Before that, they did not do that. And in the 1995 assessment, they used a sacramental phrase, if I use that word, that there is a discernible human influence on the Earth's climate. That sentence has been debated and extensively studied by a large number of scientists on both sides of the argument. And most scientists who are skeptical of the IPCC science have shown again and again and again that the warming of the Earth's climate, roughly from about 1977 till 1998, was quite possibly due to natural variability. More El Niños occurred during that period, and warming due to human CO2 emissions was possibly minimal at best. That is my personal view.
And as I'm sure you're aware, certain scientists have been taking a closer look at these climate models used by the IPCC. And some people are claiming that the IPCC's models are now, when you compare them against the reality of the past decades of climate activity, the models are vastly overstating any potential impact of human CO2 emissions. Is that something you're familiar with, the exposure of the fallacy of these models?
That is very correct. I don't claim to be an expert in climate modeling. I have done various kinds of models during my career with Environment Canada. When I took retirement more than 20 years ago, I was working on operational global spectral ocean surface wave model. But my modeling was primarily for marine operations, and our forecast would go up to 2 to 3 days at most, depending on how good the winds are. You see, when I was studying meteorology at Florida State University, one of the greatest meteorologists of our time, Professor from MIT, I don't have his name right, he used to say that he was working on the predictability of climate system. He felt that at best 2 weeks was the limit of predictability. Beyond that, models are not capable of predicting weather or climate. And now when they say that we can predict mean surface temperatures or mean temperature trend for 2050 or 2075 or 2100, I have lots of doubts on that. In fact, more and more scientists have shown that these models are highly sensitive to input of CO2. They show much higher warming than actuality.
So then I think the obvious question that has to be posed to the American population and the world population is, does the IPCC have any actual scientific credibility at this point? Is it really an independent, objective scientific presentation based on an honest scientific investigation, or is this something else?
There is definitely a lot of politics behind it. I have seen reports about the huge bureaucracy with which this IPCC is saddled with, and with their alarming projections coming from time to time, like the most recent report. And I recall when I was reviewing the 2007 documents, I came to the same conclusion. In fact, I wrote a paper in the UK-based journal Energy and Environment. The title of my paper was, "Has the IPCC exaggerated climate change impacts on humans?" And I wrote in the first paragraph that as I read through various documents of climate change, I kept wondering that if nothing is done, that means if CO2 is not reduced right away, we humans will perish world over. That was more than 11 years ago. And I think humans are doing quite well. They have added several tens of millions of populations. And in particular, the developing world of South Asia, where I originally come from. I was born and raised in India. I did my master's in statistics from Pune University in India more than 60 years ago. And there, I think people are doing well, relatively speaking, I must say. For example, India last 2-3 years has a good supply of grain thanks to the monsoon, which I have studied extensively during my lifetime. So I have a scanned page that I can't show you here right away, but I can send it to Rick Sanders and others, that 2 years ago, or a year and a half to be exact, India's grain production was highest ever at 280 million tons. At present, what I hear based on some of the newspapers that I read on internet from time to time, the food prices in India have come down, including vegetable prices. So the grains are plentiful in India. And if you go back to IPCC 2007, they kept saying that warming will reduce grain production in the world. They were totally wrong.
Well, and maybe on the other side, I think there are now numerous studies showing by direct measurements and observations that the planet is going through an increased greening in recent decades. And many people are saying we cannot ignore the fact that CO2 is going to have a positive impact on plant growth.
That's so very true. In fact, satellite imagery shows again and again enrichment of world forestry. World forestry is becoming greener. We are making the planet greener by more CO2. In a sort of a ironical way, people are talking about green technology, that is renewables, solar and wind power. I say we don't need that. The planet is becoming greener already. And talking about renewables, I think I wouldn't want to touch wind farming with a 10-foot pole, if that's the correct saying. You see, wind is the most unreliable weather parameter. It blows very hard when we don't need it, and it doesn't blow at all when we need it. And there are large problems with large industrial turbines, you see. And so I would rather be away from wind technology or wind farming. Solar farming or solar power, solar panels have done reasonably well. But again, there are problems, particularly in the high latitude region where we often have heavy cloud cover and solar panels don't work as well. Again, I'm not an expert here, but I have seen lots of reports on that. And in fact, I just got an interesting report a few days ago about an airport in southern India. It's called Kochi Airport in the southwest part of India. That airport is 100% run on solar panels right now. It has about 1,000 flights a week. It is quite busy and it is run quite efficiently. I find that very impressive.
Well, I think, maybe to come to a conclusion, I think this gets at the really broader picture, because you're talking about ideas, policies that have a huge impact on societies around the country, around the world. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think this latest IPCC report said they were calling for a range of $50 to $120 trillion in investment to get rid of carbon emissions over the next, I believe, by 2050, which is an enormous sum. And if you look at the world, huge percentage of the world population are already suffering enormously from lack of power, lack of energy. And what they're talking about can only make electricity, power dramatically more expensive for an already energy-starved world. So, we view this as such an important issue impacting the livelihood and really, life or death issues for millions and millions of people. So, that's our perspective on the importance of this, and we're happy to have people who actually have a competent scientific background able to speak to the realities of this issue. So, do you have anything for us in conclusion?
Well, I have said again and again and again that reducing carbon dioxide now will have almost no measurable impact on the Earth's climate. There are now several studies published in peer-reviewed literature which show that if all world nations agree to the Paris Climate Treaty, which was achieved in 2015 December, and all world nations reduce CO2 as mandated by the Paris Climate Treaty, then at the end of 2100, the amount of cooling of the climate will be at best 0.05 degrees. We can't even measure it by a standard thermometer. So why bother it? Why bother reducing it? I have said again and again and again that let us develop a comprehensive climate adaptation strategy, early warning system. If we improve our short-range weather and climate prediction models, like few weeks to few months, for example, then we can tell ahead of time if a severe heat wave is coming or if some severe drought is occurring. These days, we are able to predict drought few weeks to few months ahead of time, but not heat wave like several weeks ahead of time. So if we can do that, we can minimize the risk of these extreme events. Talking about sea level rise, lots of people are now showing that the glaciers are melting and sea level is rising, but that is not true. I have written a paper in which I have estimated that by 2100, the sea level rise will be between about 15 to 25 centimeters. And I have not changed this forecast as yet. In fact, I have seen papers, particularly by the World Authority on Sea Level Rise, Professor Nicholas Mörner of Stockholm University. He has written papers suggesting that future sea level rise will be at best 10 centimeters in next 100 years. There are a lot of variations or uncertainties, so the error bars are plus minus 15 centimeters. That depends upon if the climate warms extremely or if the climate cools down. Geophysicists and solar scientists are telling us that the sun is entering a grand solar minima in next decade. If that happens, most solar scientists and other climate scientists feel that the Earth's climate will enter into a long, cold phase that could be upon us for several decades. We don't need to reduce CO2 to bring down the Earth's mean temperature. In my estimation, it is already stabilized and it may start cooling down in next few years as I see it.
And as you mentioned, the best thing that we should be focusing on now is adapting to what is, I think we're seeing, largely pretty much almost completely natural variations in the climate. And some of the most important things, obviously, for allowing societies to deal with these kinds of extreme weather events is infrastructure, is increasing the power consumption and the advancement, industrialization, and development of nations, which would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, under the type of CO2 elimination schemes that the IPCC is pushing. So, I think that clearly defines what the real priorities are for mankind now looking, the IPCC wants to talk about 2050. I think we have a very different idea of what we should be looking at to achieving by 2050, which is the industrialization, the building of infrastructure, the building of forecasting capabilities to allow mankind to be better prepared to deal with what is already a naturally volatile world. And that's what we should be focused on. That's what I take from our discussion today.
What you have said is so true. I think we need to develop infrastructure and also shelters, especially in relation to strong hurricanes. For example, the recent hurricane Michael, it was sad to see such destruction. In India, in the Bay of Bengal, the country Bangladesh has suffered heavy casualties due to landfalling of tropical cyclone. To give you one example, in November of 1970, a tropical cyclone struck Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan then, and over 250,000 people were swept away. It was very sad. It was the largest human fatalities in one single weather disaster. And interestingly, that happened when the Earth's climate was cooling down. Earth's climate was cooling from 1945 to 1977 period, when CO2 was rising very rapidly. And nobody talks about it. The Earth's climate warmed from 1977 to 1998, along with CO2 increase. But in the last 20 years, according to most climate scientists, there has not been any statistically significant warming of the Earth's climate. And this sort of a no warming is often identified as the global warming hiatus, and it continues right now. So to expect that the climate will warm by 2 or 4 degrees in next 25 or 50 years is almost preposterous, I say. If the climate was to really warm by that much, I think we would start seeing it. In fact, when you check the reality, it is the cold extremes that have increased. Just 2015, Boston received 300 centimeters of snow. Why? The IPCC 2007 stated rather interestingly that in future, within few decades, snow will be gone from the land areas of the Earth. They were so wrong. I almost get a laugh out of that.
Well, I think we've clarified the issue very importantly for many people. And at the Schiller Institute, we thank you for joining us for this very important discussion. And I think what we laid out here are the actual priorities for progress for mankind and not worrying about this crazy scare story dogma put out by the IPCC. So Dr. Khandekar, thank you for taking the time today to have this discussion.
Thank you very much for having me on this show. I enjoy talking, and I hope my message is spread to various levels of scientific and environmental groups.
Okay, so with that, we will close our discussion today, and as always, the Schiller Institute will continue to cover this topic with more in the future. So we'll see you then.